In the real world, stocks are positively correlated with each other. If the economy does well, so do stocks in general, and vice versa. Correlation coefficients between stocks generally range in the vicinity of plus 0.35. A single stock selected at random would on average have a standard deviation of about 35%. As additional stocks are added to the portfolio's standard deviation decreases because the added stocks are not perfectly positively correlated, and so you get the risk reduction benefits. And then as more and more stocks are added, each new stock has less of a risk reducing impact, and eventually adding stocks has virtually no effect on the portfolio's risk as measured by standard deviation. In fact, standard deviation stabilizes at about 20% when 40 or more randomly selected stocks are added. So by combining stocks into a well-diversified portfolio, investors can eliminate almost half the riskiness of holding individual stocks. Just remember, it's not completely costless to diversify, so even the largest institutional investors hold less than all stocks. Even index funds generally hold a smaller portfolio than that is highly correlated with an index such as the S&P 500 rather than just holding all the stocks in the S&P 500. One implication is very clear. Investors should hold well-diversified portfolios of stocks rather than individual stocks. Individuals can hold diversified portfolios through mutual fund investments. By doing this, they can eliminate about half of the riskiness that are part of individual stocks. Here's an example for two perfectly negatively correlated stocks, and that symbol is rho, and it's like a R. Sometimes we just use a lowercase r, and it's -1. That means they move exactly the opposite of each other. So you can see that stock W is the red line, and then stock M is the blue line. And since they're perfectly negatively correlated, if we add those two stocks together, then the new portfolio expected return would be at a constant 15% with no standard deviation. So holding each of those separately, you see a big standard deviation from -10 to up to 40% return with an expected return of 15%. And when we combine them both together, we get like this 0% standard deviation, 15% rate of return, which is really great. If I could find an investment like that, I would definitely choose that. And then here's what would happen if we combine two stocks that were perfectly positively correlated with each other. That means they both move exactly the same way. So you have stock M and stock M prime. So they both have the same movements. As you can see, these two graphs are the same. And so if we combine them, we'll have this no reduction in risk. It'll just be the same type of volatile portfolio. So there's no benefit to adding two perfectly positively correlated stocks together in a portfolio. And then what if we have a partial correlation where we have stock Y is the blue line and stock W is the red line? They're correlated at plus 0.35, and then when we add them, we do have some risk reduction benefits. So held separately, you see the example like what we had before with this orange graph, and then held together, WY together has this higher percent, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hit that, a higher percent of the 15, a higher portion of the histogram shows that the returns are closer to the expected rate of return of 15%. So it does reduce the overall risk. And you can see this curve doesn't go all the way to -10% and 40% like this curve in orange does up here. And this is just a summary slide of kind of what we were talking about. So the magic number is, well, some people say 12 to 40 stocks to basically get down to the standard deviation of 20%. And so what we're saying here is this is just to get down to a standard deviation of 20%, which is still quite large, and that's why If you've ever had any kind of a stock account, you see that it goes up and down, and if you watch it every day, it could give you kind of like a heart attack. But um, this is the best we can do, and we might as well at least get down to 20% rather than having something like 35 to 40% standard deviation. And then this is a really good graph kind of showing the two types of risk that makes up the total risk or standard deviation of a stock. Remember, we talked about total risk and we said that it was standard deviation. So this blue line is all the way up to like holding one stock. We're assuming we have that average standard deviation of 35%. And as we add more and more stocks, then we lower our standard deviation, and then we got to the magic number of what they said was 40, to where you can't really, if you keep adding more stocks, you're not really going to reduce the standard deviation to below 20%. I know for some reason they were very precise with 20.4, I guess right at the dotted line. But this graph is divided into two parts. This darker blue area is the firm-specific risk that can be diversified away by adding more and more stocks together that are not perfectly positively correlated with each other. And this light blue portion that's below the dotted line is the market level of risk, and you can never diversify away that level of risk. So that's why we say we can only get this total risk down to the 20%. So we have two types of risk: firm-specific risk, which is diversifiable, and market risk, which is not diversifiable. And so here's that equation with standalone risk, which is standard deviation, is market risk plus diversifiable risk. And we've talked about here the two definitions that we just saw in the graph. Here we have the question of, if an investor chooses to hold a one-stock portfolio, so they don't diversify at all, would that investor be compensated for the extra risk that they are bearing? Well, if you hold a one-stock portfolio, you will be exposed to a high degree of risk, but you won't be compensated for it. If the return were high enough to compensate you for your high risk, it would be a bargain for the more rational, diversified investors. All of those investors would start buying it, and these buy orders would drive the price up and the return down. Therefore, you just could not find stocks in the market with returns high enough to compensate you for the stock's diversifiable risk.